Good afternoon, and thank you for joining the RLS Foundation's webinar titled Brain Donor Project. My name is Carla Diezenkowski, and I'm the Executive Director of the RLS Foundation. Before we begin, please be aware that all attendees will remain on mute during the hour. We thank you for the questions submitted with your registration. Ms. Hevel will answer as many questions as time allows at the conclusion of her presentation. The surge in the use of web-based programs during the COVID-19 health crisis has created a strain on the system. If you are experiencing technical difficulties, switch to the audio portion of the program as it uses less bandwidth, and be sure that your webcam is turned off. We thank you for attending and appreciate your patience and understanding with any technical difficulties that may arise during today's webinar presentation. After the webinar, you will receive an email with a link to the webinar recording. The webinar recording will also be made available in the member portal section of our website. If you are not a Foundation member, and if you would like to view this and other recorded webinars, we invite you to become a member today by going to rls.org. As always, individuals suspecting that they have RLS should consult a qualified healthcare provider. Information offered in this webinar is for informational purposes and should not be considered as a substitute for the advice of a healthcare provider. Our speaker today is Tish Hevel, and she is the founder and CEO of the Brain Donor Project, an innovative non-for-profit that exclusively supports the Neurobiobank of the National Institutes of Health by raising awareness of the critical need for donated brain tissue and by simplifying the donation process. Since its launch in 2016, nearly 10,000 people have signed up to become brain donors from all 50 states, representing hundreds of brain diseases and disorders. Tish is an Emmy-winning journalist, PR professional, and was Chief Communications Officer for a 42-county region of the American Red Cross. The Brain Donor Project was inspired by her father, Jean Armentrout, a brain donor who died from Lewy body dementia in 2015. Tish, we thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today, and I now invite you to begin your presentation.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you what we've learned about the importance of brain donation. And it's because it is an absolutely urgent situation in medical research. It's urgent for two reasons. One, scientific investigators say it is quite simply the most precious resource known to man, and we are behind the eight ball when it comes to breakthroughs. It's been quite a while since we've had some significant ones. The problem is that not enough people know about the critical need for brain donation, or they have some misperceptions about it. And I'll go through some of the common ones and explain to you why they aren't valid. The first one is, the biggest one that I hear all the time is that if you have checked the box to become an organ donor, it includes brain donation. That is not the case. Separate arrangements need to be made. Or if you plan to become a body donor, that's the same thing. It isn't. Body donation programs are for anatomical study, and the brain is much more valuable for neurologic research. A third one is that only diseased brains are needed. That is also incorrect. In fact, it couldn't be more wrong. Healthy brains, those of people who haven't been diagnosed with a neurologic disorder, are often referred to as non-affected controls. They are at least as valuable and absolutely critical to comparative science. Brain donation is also not disfiguring. An open casket is still an option. And when donating to the brain banks of the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, there is no cost to the family. So we kind of learned this the hard way. And in fact, we learned it the hard way 6 years ago yesterday when my dad passed. We are not scientists. In 2014, my dad was diagnosed with suspected Lewy bodies dementia, and we came upon some information about brain donation while researching that disorder. So we donated his brain when we passed, And then we called up this guy named Walter Koroshetz, who happened to be the director of the National Institute of Neurologic Disorders and Stroke at the NIH, and asked if we could help them get the word out because it was kind of complicated at the time. And the people that we spoke to about what we had done with my dad's brain were very interested, and they wanted to find out how they could also make arrangements to donate their brains. So based on all that and our conversation with Dr. Koroshetz, we started the Brain Donor Project. One of the benefits, which leads me to one of the big benefits of being a family member of a brain donor, and that is that it's been helpful for me to speak from experience about the very real sense of comfort that comes from donating a loved one's brain. It does help in a very difficult situation. And secondly, as this slide illustrates, the family receives a neuropathology report when you donate a brain through the Neurobiobank. As you know, many neurologic disorders can't be definitively diagnosed until after death. So while my dad's doctors suspected Lewy bodies dementia, they didn't know for sure until his post-mortem exam, which is the case with so many neurodegenerative diseases. So these are what they call his histology images. I'm told the dark purple spots on the slide indicate the presence of the alpha-synuclein protein. That's the hallmark of Lewy bodies. So someday when more is known about that disease and his inheritability, this will be important information for his kids and grandchildren. So after all of that, the Brain Donor Project was formed to further the science of supporting science. Here's how the Brain Donor Project works. We exclusively support the Neurobiobank of the National Institutes of Health. That is the nation's only federated network of brain banks that works to supply researchers with high quality, well-characterized, which is well-categorized brain tissue. Our focus is on simplifying the process to become a brain donor and also to raise awareness of the critical need for people to become brain donors. We think of ourselves as functioning as kind of a conduit to the brain banks of the Neurobiobank. This illustrates that relationship. That's all we do. We support the Neurobiobank of the NIH. Currently, the Neurobiobank has 5 locations that serve the public across the country. They all operate on one set of guidelines when it comes to procuring the tissue and distributing it for scientific research. The brain banks are located at Harvard, Mount Sinai in New York, the University of Maryland, the University of Miami in Florida, and at UCLA in Southern California. There's also another one at Pittsburgh, but it works exclusively with the medical examiner's office there. So these are the ones that we refer people to. This part's kind of important because it tells you what's different about the Neurobiobank and how it works. The key differences between this brain bank system and any others you may have heard about are that those are usually disease specific. The Neurobiobank is the nation's only network, as I said, of federated ones. It distributes tissue based on the merits of the study and nothing else. Researchers don't need to be connected with a certain program or university to receive the tissue. Not all brain banks work that way, and it's important because scientists agree that the tissue needs to be widely available if we're going to advance science. Also, the NBB accepts and encourages the donation of control brains. This is absolutely necessary, as we mentioned, for comparative science. Many disease-specific problems or programs do not, but the Neurobiobank does. Also, all researchers who receive tissue are held to the highest standards of transparency, and required publication of results is integral to the program. They need to publish these results in an online portal that their peers can access anytime. It's how science should work. If you all remember when then Vice President Joe Biden, when his son died of cancer and President Obama put him in charge of what was then called the Cancer Moonshot, and it was to find immunotherapies against cancer as soon as possible. The first problem he identified is that he felt like none of the professionals were talking to each other, that there was way too much proprietary thinking, and that stifled collaboration. So science kind of agrees with that. And that's why this transparency and the ability of scientists to build on each other's findings is kind of critical. So, and it also supports academia and industry, because answers can come from researchers in both fields. So the three big differences are they accept and control disease brains, they distribute tissue based on what will be learned from it, and they make researchers share. These are all critical components of the NeuroBiobank. So here's how one goes about beginning the process of becoming a brain donor. You go to braindonorproject.org. That is our site. If you have questions, here's where you get them answered. The site walks you through the process of pre-registration, then registration with a brain bank, and then it tells you what happens upon death. There's also a pretty thorough frequently asked questions section. When you're ready, you complete a brief online form, which contains mainly contact information. It also asks whether you're signing up on behalf of yourself or someone else right at the beginning. And then it asks for a neurologic diagnosis if there is one. So once you have completed and submitted the form, the Brain Donor Project determines which brain bank is most appropriate for that individual. And it arranges for the future donor to connect with that brain bank. Usually that decision is based on geography, how close you are to one of the brain banks, but there are also some other factors that come into play. Some of the banks have specific exclusionary criteria, some have areas of focus, and so we work to honor those differences. The Brain Donor Project then sends the registration forms for that brain bank either by email or by regular mail, depending on which the person has chosen. Those documents need to be signed and returned to the brain bank in order for the individual to be considered a registered donor of that brain bank. And it's very important that that registration be completed prior to death. So what I've just explained is an ideal scenario from a patient family point of view. As you certainly know, circumstances surrounding death are not always ideal, and so this process can be expedited if necessary. It's become more complicated during these times of COVID, so we like to remind people that never has it been more important to try to get this registration completed in advance. So here's how it works upon death. The brain bank asks to be notified quickly, ideally within the hour of death. Things have to move fast because the brain needs to be back at the brain bank well within 24 hours. In order for that to happen, the brain bank arranges for the body to be transported to a local facility, somewhere in the same town as the donor, and often that can be the funeral home the family is working with. If not, the brain bank will identify a different location like a medical school or a mortuary facility, and the brain bank sends a pathologist or recovery specialist there to remove the brain through the back of the head so as not to be disfiguring. The brain is then shipped to the brain bank. All of this is done at no cost to the family. The NIH considers this tissue so important that it reimburses all parties along the way for the costs up to this point. After that, the body is released to the family to carry out whatever funeral, burial, cremation plans have been arranged. Of course, the family pays for that part just as they would if no brain donation had taken place. So who is signing up? We've been in operation for just about 4.5 years, and at this point, more than 10,000 people have signed up. About half of them are controls. You can see there's a wide range of ages, but I will tell you it's a challenge to obtain tissue from across the lifespan. These folks come from all 50 states, represent more than 160 categories of neurologic disorder and disease. Also, we work to get the word out about all of this in two key ways. One is by working with patient organizations such as the RLS Foundation to educate communities on how this gift can advance the science of that particular disease or disorder. We are always impressed by the number of people who've suffered themselves and want to make sure that ensuing generations don't have to continue to suffer the same way. We also work with other professional groups, such as the American Association of Neuroscience Nurses and various hospice and palliative care experts. And when we can, we've been fortunate to be featured in some broad media outlets, like this piece that was in National Geographic in October of 2018, which led to a whole lot of interest from around the world, actually. So in wrapping up this portion of the presentation, I just wanted to, we ask people to think a little more broadly about their legacy. Whether you have RLS or another disorder, or you care about someone who does, you are really in a position to advance science. Please think about that awesome opportunity to contribute and consider donating your brain when the time comes. Then register in advance. Tell your family so they can see to your wishes. That's such a critical part of the process. And you can visit braindonorproject.org to learn more. And with that, Carla, let's talk questions.
All right, well, thank you for that great presentation. And we have a lot of questions, so let's get started here. A number of years ago, I signed up to be a brain donor. So is that still valid?
It depends on who you signed up with. I would double check with that entity and find out. Many brain banks change over time. The Neurobiobank, as I mentioned, we're only 6 years old and they're only like 8 years old. So I would check with the entity with which you registered and see if they are still in a position to accept. And then you can make a decision about going through with that way. But yeah, I would check to make sure it's still valid and the brain bank is operating the way you understand it was at the time. And then you can decide.
Okay. Are there any medical conditions or lifestyle issues that rule out participation in tissue donation?
Yeah, there are a few, but not many. So stroke is a decline factor. I'm told by the neuroscientists that it tends to change the structure of the tissue in a way that renders it not viable for research. Um, Also, systemic infection, systemic infectious disease, and Lyme disease, which behaves like a systemic infectious disease. So those are decline factors. Um, it's also become a decline factor if too much time has passed. You know how I was talking about the brain must be retrieved quickly and ideally back at the brain bank stored properly well within 24 hours. So if too much time has passed during what they call that postmortem interval, then that is also a decline factor for brain donation. Let's see, geography, we cannot accept brains from outside of the US because it just takes too long and it elongates that interval before the brain is properly stored. It's just too complicated. However, you might be interested in knowing that about 30% of the tissue that's distributed by the Neurobiobank is distributed internationally. So it makes me very proud to know that, the Neurobiobank supports science everywhere. So I think those are the only conditions.
Okay.
Yeah,
Can multiple research areas directly benefit from one brain donation?
absolutely. Absolutely. The people who run the Neurobiobank and make decisions about scientists' requests for tissue are very responsible stewards of this precious tissue. So they will, they'll vet all the requests so that not too much is being asked. But the truth is, the scientists really only need small amounts from certain specific regions of the brain. So a single brain can be used in dozens and dozens of studies, and oftentimes control brains can be used in even more. So Yes, it's not just one study that receives the tissue. It's so valuable, it gets used from many studies.
Can my family protest my wish to donate?
Um, yes, they can, because once you're gone, they are the people that are charged with carrying out your wishes or not. The brain banks are very hesitant to get in the middle of a situation where some family members may disagree with others. So if everyone's not on board, then it likely won't happen. And that's why we tell everybody that one of the most important things you do once you get registered is to talk with your family and tell them why you've made this choice and explain to them how important that it is. And then designate probably two family members that are younger than you to make sure they know the 24/7 phone number to your brain bank and where that number is kept, so that they can see what you want to have done so that they can see it through. So yeah, and if no one calls the brain bank, then that gets in the way of your wish to donate. You're dependent
Mhm.
on the people around you to see through what you want to have happen. So absolutely.
Correct. Can the brain be donated to RLS and the rest of the body be donated to another organization?
Yes, and this is exciting. The brain can be donated for neuroscience research, and the rest of the body can go to an anatomic study program, but it's a little bit tricky. So I tell people who are interested in research to further disease that the most important thing they can do is donate their brain, because everyone agrees that the brain is so much more valuable for any kind of neurologic research than the body is for anatomic. So register your brain first. Then you need to locate an anatomical body donation program that will accept the body once the brain has been removed. They don't usually put that information on their website. So you're going to have to call. The easiest way to do is to do an online search for body donation programs in blank, your area, and then call them to see if they will, in fact, accept a body from which the brain has already been removed. Some do, some don't. There's not a lot of logic to it that I've really figured out. Some programs are very adamant that the body really needs to be intact for the medical students, and some have come to recognize that the brain serves a greater purpose otherwise. I will tell you, we did this for my dad, and it was kind of cool how it worked out. So my father happened to die at home under hospice care, and so the anatomic program that he was registered with, we notified them and the brain bank, and they coordinate so that the family doesn't have to get in the middle of these kinds of arrangements at a time when no one was going to feel like it, right? So the body donation program came and they picked him up at home and took him back to the body donation program, which was affiliated with a medical school, as most of them are. They recovered his brain there, removed it, and shipped it from central Ohio, southwestern Ohio, to LA at the time. It was a little bit different then. We weren't so geographically centered, but they shipped his brain and kept his body there at the body donation program. They can't keep them quite as long as they would otherwise, which may be, part of the reason that some of them won't accept body under those conditions. But they're able to keep him for a good 6 months, and then they just treat it like the other bodies where they do a cremation at the end of its useful period. And we were very pleased with that because we felt like all of his parts were going to good use. So
Mhm.
yes, it's tricky, but it can definitely be done.
Okay. Can you designate that you would like your brain used for RLS research?
Um, Not really, and let me explain why. Um, so when the brain comes in, say it's me, I've died and I have made arrangements to donate my brain. As soon as it is received by the brain bank, It goes through a wide variety of assessments, including whole genome sequencing. And so after that time has passed, and that assessment process also includes toxicology and serology tests, all the medical records. Donors sign a medical records release prior to their death, but it is executed upon their death so that it gets the most recent information and medical records that the person had. And in some cases, interviews are conducted with family members. The reason for that is not every neurologic disease has well-defined biomarkers, where they can assess the brain and go, oh, this is the brain of a person that had X, because it's so evident in the tissue. Some diseases like RLS, require a little more diagnostic digging. And so that is why the medical records come into play, because that has all the information that your doctor has done to assess your situation. And then what happens is once the brain is adequately assessed that way, then it is characterized as such. In my case, whatever age woman with, at this point, no diseases, but say I had dementia. So it's dementia. And then usually because of the autopsy will show what kind of dementia, it would specify that. So let's say it was Lewy bodies, like my dad. Researchers then who are looking for brain tissue from an X-year-old female, certain brain region who was diagnosed with X, that tissue is made available to them. So that's a long way of saying we don't guarantee that anybody's tissue is going to be used for whatever disease they say that that's what they want, because the actual end of life assessment could prove otherwise. And that's especially true in cases of people who have control brains, and they say, I have a family member who had this disease, and therefore I want to contribute my brain to be used for this disease. That's just not responsible stewardship of the tissue, especially for controls, because they can be used for so many studies. It would be not fair to do that. Is that a good explanation?
I think that's great. I think it talks about all the different aspects that go into it. We just don't, they look at your diagnosis, but they go back to your medical records and you're going into the genome sequencing and other things to confirm that diagnosis. So that way, when the doctor or the researcher has access to that tissue, they're confident that it is somebody with RLS or it's a control brain situation. So those are all things that I know too, that they'll look at that as a researcher because they'll put it in, that's part of their study.
Exactly. And the more, they call it metadata or preclinical data, the more information that is available on any brain makes it so much more valuable to science. So if tests have been, administered and that information is part of the file, or if the person has completed for example, the Johns Hopkins-based questionnaire that's out there about RLS, since there's a lot of questions that have to be answered for that diagnosis to be made. Those things make the tissue much more valuable because work has been done in advance that helps characterize the tissue.
Mm-hmm. Does my status as an official organ donor include my brain?
It does not. And that's the biggest misconception I work to correct all the time. Brain donation is not a part of organ donation. People ask me why all the time, and I think some of the reasons are that, organ donation is done for transplant purposes. Nobody's transplanting brains yet, and I think that's going to be a long way off, if ever. So the organ procurement organizations, the organ donor groups, they don't focus on it because they are in a hurry to get to the other parts. And I understand that. It's also, organ donation is a part of, it's federal law, and I think it just takes a while to change that. A lot of us fantasize that that's the ultimate end game, that somehow brain donation is included in organ donation as an opt-in or opt-out, because that surely would help increase the amount of tissue that's available. But for now, it's not a part of it, and separate arrangements need to be made. I will. Let me add one more thing, though. It's
Hmm.
possible to do both. It's very possible to do both, to be an organ donor and a brain donor. And, if it's determined that the donor has organs that would save a person's life, if there's organs that are available for transplant, that obviously takes priority, and the brain is secondary. Otherwise, the two teams coordinate how they can do both, how they can protect the donor's wishes, and it is very possible to do both.
Does the extraction of brain tissue in any way alter the physical look of the head for viewing?
That's a good question, because the answer is no for an open casket.
Hmm.
Everything is through the back of the head. I won't act like it's a tiny incision, because it isn't. It's a tough procedure. But again, it's all hidden. So many brain donors proceed to have an open casket, and it doesn't, the body does not belie any trauma. So yeah, it's
Do,
very workable.
hmm How do we stipulate organ donation in legal documents, i.e., wills, trusts, medical directives?
Okay, so for organ donation, it's a little bit different. Once you've signed on the registry, um, that's one process. And then, when you are near death or at death, the organ donation organizations work with the hospital and or the family to make that happen. With brain donation, a lot of people ask this: do I need to put something in my will, or do I need to do an advanced medical directive about brain donation? And we tell people, usually that's too late. If you think about it, by the time someone considers a will or other documents about end of life that really are considered after the end of life, the whole window for brain donation has closed. So the best way, again, is to register in advance and talk to your family. Talk to the people who will be seeing to your wishes when you're gone, and make sure they understand what they need to do, because you've put it all in place in advance. Those other documents are not sufficient, because if you haven't registered, then they got to scramble to figure out what to do, and chances are it won't be doable.
Hmm. Next question is, I'm on the Alzheimer's brain donor list. Can you share?
I'm not aware of the Alzheimer's brain donor list. We are the Alzheimer's Association, and yeah, the Alzheimer's Association, I think, is the big one. They refer to us for people who are interested in brain donation, as does the NIH. If you would go to the Neurobiobank's website, which is at neurobiobank.nih.gov, that their website says, "Hey, we're glad you're here. If you're a scientist, here's where you go to look at the tissue. You enter your credentials and tell us about your study, and then you can request the tissue that you need. If you're here because you want to be a brain donor, that's great. We really need you." And it links to the Brain Donor Project to start the process. So there are some, they're called ADRCs, Alzheimer's Disease Resource Centers, around the country at different hospitals. And those are great. Those are awesome facilities that are run by the National Institute for Aging. And usually people who agree to be studied in advance of death, while they're still living because they have dementia. The brain donation is a part of that study. After they get all the data that they need, then the people who are involved in those studies have agreed to donate their brains. And those places do have brain banks. So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by the Alzheimer's brain donor list. If you're affiliated with an ADRC, an Alzheimer's Disease Resource Center, and plan to donate your brain there, you're in great hands. So I would say you don't need to change anything. Cooperate with them as much as you can. For any other sort of brain donation, I know the Alzheimer's Foundation refers to us and directs people to us. So that's,
Hmm.
yeah.
um, the next question, this is another one about affiliations and things, but I think these are all important questions to ask is, I'm affiliated with the Anatomical Society of Florida. Do they connect with the Brain Donor Project? I'm assuming this person is assuming, like, will they coordinate the donation of their brain tissue automatically, or is this something, again, where they're going to have to make sure we take care of both processes in
Yeah,
advance?
I'm not familiar with that particular one. I know there are, um, a lot of times the anatomical society of a certain place is the organization that oversees um, anatomical body donation programs. And again, it's on a case by case. There are also some other companies I'm aware of that operate, some of them operate in different parts of the country. There's one called Science Care out west. And basically, they use the body for medical research, is what they call it. And I'm not, you know, totally familiar with what they do. I know that they'll use some connective tissue, and I don't know exactly what research that is, but most of those kinds of organizations that will take the whole body for medical research are very willing to allow somebody to take the brain for neuroscience research first. So again, I would call anybody that you're thinking of working with in advance, because, and it's not just my bias, I know I'm very biased about a brain donation being so important, but scientists agree that the brain is so much more important for neurologic study than than the body is for anatomic study. So, I get wanting to do both. It's a good feeling to do both, but to make sure that you are connected with an anatomic study that will accommodate, or an anatomic body donation program that will accommodate your wishes to be a brain donor.
If I donated my brain tissue, would I also be able to donate my corneas?
Yes, those two groups work together very well. So definitely.
Hmm. Is the whole brain used? This is a two-part question. And then what is done with the tissues that are left over?
So that's a very good question. The whole brain is used, generally speaking, and there are a lot of exceptions to this, but half the brain is frozen and half the brain is fixed. And by fixed, I mean preserved in formula. Okay. And they are used forever. They're used forever. There are brains in freezers of the frozen tissue, obviously, that have been there for 60 years and 70 years since brain banking was, first, I won't say first invented because they
Hmm.
probably did that a lot longer ago, but since, modern brain banking became more common, that are still in use, that they still get samples from. There really isn't an expiration date or a limited shelf life for brain tissue. So the good news is, they've found ways to make use of that tissue, regardless of which method it was stored, frozen or fixed, to use it for what is so far not a finite period of time. So it's still around. They don't dispose of it because it's still useful for science.
Is there an age limit for donation?
No, um, not at all. In fact, I mentioned briefly before that there are some challenges in um, obtaining brain tissue across the lifespan. As you might expect, a lot of the majority of the brains that are in supply are from older people. These are people who've, lived a long life and then made it to a natural death or a disease-caused death late in life. Because of the way developmental disorders happen and for other reasons, there are brains that are less available from younger people. And so that's an issue. Children, it's tragic when children die. And this is one of the challenges I face is trying to talk to parents about the fact that, we're all going to die someday. It's just a question of how long we have until then and how, you know? And so I feel like it's so important for people to be at least exposed to the concept of brain donation in their lifetime. Like now is not a bad time, so that when the time does come, um, it isn't the first time you've heard about it. You know, think about this for a minute. In the case of autism, autistic children don't die from autism. They often die because they've been involved in accidents and drownings or whatever. And if, while those brains are so critical for the research of autism, or let's say a healthy child has died tragically in a way that, their brain would be useful. If the first time that parent has even considered the idea of donating their child's brain is when the unthinkable has happened, it's too late. It's too traumatic to think clearly about it. So, yeah, it's very, I don't even remember what your initial question was, honestly. But
Yeah. What about what age is it? Do you
yeah,
accept
yeah.
tissue from all age groups?
Yeah, all age groups are really needed. And I will tell you, I got to hold the brain um, of a 101-year-old man who was still very astute at the time he died. And his brain was larger than is typical for a person of his age. And it was just awesome to be able to do that. But there are so many studies on healthy aging. And by aging, I mean, people who are really old. There are lots and lots of studies about brain function and how it deteriorates or doesn't in older people. So, yeah, there is no age limit. All brains have some story to tell. And it doesn't matter how old you are for it to be valuable.
Can
Sorry, I got
brain,
really off
yeah,
track
oh,
there.
no, that's okay. But I'm going to
Okay,
ask you some questions that you talked about in your presentation because we've had some people add on just so that we can get the information out and
sure.
keep
Happy to.
everyone up to speed. Can donated brain tissue be moved across country and continents for research?
One way, but not the other. So we cannot accept at the Neurobiobank, which operates in the U.S. only. They cannot accept brain donations from outside of the country, and the main reason for that is because it is complicated for the tissue to come from that far away and to enter our country. It slows down the process too much and extends what is called the PMI, the postmortem interval, which has to be as brief as possible. So long story short, no, there are no brains accepted from outside of the country. When people come to the Brain Donor Project and ask about that, I try to refer them to brain banks in their part of the world. However, about 30% of what the Neurobiobank ships in terms of brain samples to scientists, 30% of what they ship is international. So I think it's great to know that the National Institutes of Health are supporting scientific neurologic research all around the world.
Okay. My re my revocable trust, living trust directs that my body be given to a local medical school. Can I give my brain separately to the Brain Donor Project?
Yes, you can if the anatomical body donation program will accept a body for anatomical research from which the brain has been removed for neuroscience elsewhere. And I'll repeat, the critical part of that is to make sure that you're registered to be a brain donor first, as that is inarguably more important. Then find a body donation program that will do what you want to do and register with both entities, tell them about each other, and then when the time comes, make sure your family notifies both the brain bank and the body donation program so those two organizations can coordinate together the transportation and logistics of what has to take place. It's a really great thing to be able to do both, but you are dependent on you're at the mercy of the body donation programs that operate in your part of the world. They don't transport bodies very far, that you can't like ship your body to a body donation program states away. So you are really, you're limited by what the anatomical programs in your area will allow.
Okay. Please confirm there will be minimal financial or emotional cost to my executors.
Minimal financial or
Financial and emotional cost to my executors.
that's an interesting question. I can
Yes.
confirm there will be very minimal financial cost. So upon death, the body is transported someplace for the retrieval. The brain bank sends a pathologist or recovery person there. That person removes the brain through the back of the head and ships it to the brain bank. All of that is at no cost to the family. The NIH reimburses everybody along the way for that, and it's coordinated through the brain bank. So the family just pays for the funeral or cremation as if no donation had taken place. That is the case when you donate to the brain banks of the NIH, which is what we support. So I can confirm that there is no additional financial cost upon death for brain donation. It's just whatever the family just pays for cremation or burial as if no donation had taken place. The emotional cost is an interesting question. My own experience has been that there is an emotional benefit of brain donation. It was very comforting to us to know that after the suffering my dad endured and that we saw him go through, that we were playing a part in perhaps future generations not having to go through Lewy bodies dementia or not having to suffer with the disease that he had. And I hear that back from so many families of donors that say, you know, at a time when they were going through what was pretty unspeakable grief, you know, any significant loss is just awful. And it doesn't, you know, brain donation doesn't make everything better, but there's some comfort in knowing that, you know, somebody else might not have to suffer like your person did because you're doing things to advance the science of that disease. So there's a funny question about emotional costs. I would say that there's an emotional benefit to that from my point of view.
I'll have to concur with you. I lost my father to Alzheimer's, but when he got that devastating diagnosis, you know, all seven of us, you know, his children were sitting around a table and he said that's what he wanted to do. And so my mom honored that request. But, you know, when he did pass, it gave me some peace knowing that he was going to help other people. And that was something that he said, look, I don't need it anymore. Let's see if I can help someone else. And
I
so,
know.
you know, that was the part that was, you know, comforting that, you know, we knew that we followed through
I
with it. And so,
You've written about that so well. You know,
mhm.
what you've written about is how it made you feel. I thought was really powerful, Carla.
Well, thank you. I wrote that on the anniversary of his death. I was like, I just need to get this out today, you know,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
it was, you know, it was peace. It was, like you said, it was reassuring. It was more of a, we knew that he was doing something further on, you know, maybe his time is done on the earth, but not what he can contribute to humanity. And so we were able to fulfill that. So I think,
yeah,
you know, it's, you know, all of his children, we felt, you know, peace with his decision and that we honored his request. And
yeah.
so we'll get to learn more and hopefully, you know, as you said with your dad's Lewy body dementia, my dad's Alzheimer's, it may help us, you know, with this disease if we in turn have it.
I hear you. I hear you.
Okay, so what paperwork is needed after you pass to make this donation?
Well, if you've registered in advance, that's the key thing because those registration forms are your copy of the pieces of them that are germane. Your family, so ideally, your family would know where those are stored and know the phone number that they need to call to notify your brain bank. So that's the most important thing to be registered in advance and have, you know, one or two people who are, you know, probably significantly younger than you be designated as the folks to see this through. It's, you know, people ask a lot of times about, you know, living wills and trusts and what should I put in my will or my end of life papers. All of those things are not important. I talk to estate attorneys all the time who are like, I'm helping somebody with this, and what's the wording I should put in their will? And it's like, yeah, it doesn't. That's not going to ensure it happens. Somebody still has to find a brain bank, and so it's so much. If you really want to see this happen, some work needs to be done in advance, and there's no paperwork that can make it happen if the plans haven't been put in place.
Right. So in our family, we had my mom and my sister who lives in the area because we're all around the country to make sure
Mhm.
that it did happen. And so we all were able to make it. We had a little bit of a warning, and so it made it a lot easier to be there with them.
Yeah, yeah,
But
that's
it was that was one of the things that when we sat down and did our planning as a family, that we had that step in place. So something to think about, I'd say.
it is.
Um,
It is.
so well, that goes into the next question is, know who needs to know if we choose to be a donor, you know?
So, some people have said, do I tell my doctor? Is it important for my doctor? It's like, no, that's not going to help anything. Your doctor isn't involved in what happens with you once you've passed. That there will be people in your life, who will be with you at the end. And the most important thing that you can do is make sure that the people who care about you know exactly what you want to have done and do the work for them. You know, do the work for them. Get yourself signed up so that when you talk to them about it, you're basically saying to them, I have decided this is what I want to have happen with my brain. And if you've made other decisions, you can talk about those too. But because of that, I went ahead and registered with a brain bank. I am now a registered future donor of X brain bank. Here's their phone number. I'm going to give it to you now. I'm also going to put it in this file that will be housed, here specifically, so that, when I die, I am entrusting you and maybe somebody else to make that phone call and to help notify the people that need to be notified so that this can happen. One of the things we sometimes tell people too, that it doesn't hurt, if you're with somebody who is clearly declining, and clearly death is coming. We did this with my dad. We called the brain bank to say, hey, this isn't, things aren't looking good right now. And so we call these people flag wavers. We're calling the brain bank to say, hello, I just want to give you a heads up that things aren't looking good, so that there probably will be, a brain to retrieve sometime soon. That, if you're able to do that, that's great. It helps the brain bank make sure they've got a recovery specialist in the area. Maybe call the funeral home that you've arranged with to see that the plans are doable the way they initially would want, and to shore up any logistical things that could get in the way at the end. We always tell people that even though you're registered, we can't guarantee 100% that this will go through. Things can happen logistically. You saw that huge snow and ice storm in
Mhm.
Texas, this summer. I bet that messed up a lot of plans, and it certainly would have gotten in the way of the logistics of getting somebody where they needed to be quickly, whether they were a brain donor or just a regular person. It's just
Mhm.
there are circumstances arise. And so if it's something important, we encourage people to make that phone call and just let people know it could be happening soon. And is there anything they need to do to help make sure everything is in place?
All right, so this will be your last question. Will my
Mm.
surviving spouse and or son be informed of the results of this research and any particular benefit of my donation?
So here's what the family does receive. We tell people that if you request it of the brain bank will provide to the family a copy of the donor's summary of neuropathological findings. And that is the result of the autopsy of the brain that happens post mortem. What that tells the family at that point is were there any diagnoses of the brain, confirming what was suspected or anything else that was found. So you get the definitive word on any diagnoses of the brain, the stage of the disease, and the regions of the brain that were impacted. We find this helpful for two reasons. It's largely most helpful with neurodegenerative diseases like dementias and Parkinson's and ALS, because it's the most definitive diagnosis that anybody will receive. They're making really, really educated guesses in advance, but it's not definitive. So not only will that information at the end tell you the definitive diagnosis, but it can explain some behaviors that might have taken place. And it's very helpful information for the family once we learn more about the inheritability of those diseases, as scientists come up with ways to diagnose, prevent, cure those diseases. As for information that would come back after research has done, that's not something that they're doing. So, all you will know is, for example, if you've donated your brain for RLS research, down the road, human brain tissue was used for findings on RLS, it could have been your family member. We'll never know for sure those things. It's too cumbersome, and it could violate some privacy issues for that to happen. But you'll know that there's a really good chance, because they need this tissue to get to the next set of breakthroughs in so many fields.
Very true. Well, Tish, thank you so much for spending this time with us and really enlightening us, all of us, about the Brain Donor Project. And I think it's been very helpful. We always get questions about this at the foundation, and it's nice to be able to have this resource for our.
You are very welcome. I was happy to be a part of it. And just so you know, my email address is tish@braindonorproject.org. And I'm happy to communicate with anybody who has additional questions.
Well, thank you so much. Everyone have a great afternoon. If you want to sign up for future webinars, go to rls.org and click on the Get Involved tab. Have a great day, everyone.